Good afternoon. Welcome to today's SCA webinar with the top 10 reasons to refrac organic shale wells with results from Eagle Ford and Haynesville case studies with Bob Barbet. Before we start today's webinar, we'd like to ask a few questions about the demographics of the audience. So let me share the polling questions. And our first poll is, what's your primary discipline? The responses are coming in now. Looks like we have 2/3 petroleum engineers in the audience. The next most popular response is geoscience, followed by other. Perhaps we have quite a few petrophysicists in the audience. Okay, so most of you have voted, so let me go ahead and share the results. 59% petroleum engineers, 24% geoscience, 15% other, and 3% petrophysics. So our next question is, how many years of full-time experience do you have in the upstream oil and gas industry? So the responses are coming in now. We have quite a range. Most are in the 21 to 30 year. Responses are still coming in. I'll go ahead and close the poll. I think we've gotten most of the responses. So we have the highest percentage is over 30 years experience, followed closely by the 21 to 30 years experience. And then 24% of you are in the 11 to 20 year experience range. So before we start to introduce Bob, I'd like to remind the audience that you are muted, but you can ask questions during the presentation using the GoToWebinar question feature. We'll cover the Q&A at the end of the presentation, and you will be anonymous. So again, this is the webinar on the top 10 reasons to refrac organic shale wells with Eagle Ford and Haynesville case studies. Bob Barbet. Whoops, I'm sorry, I pulled up the wrong PowerPoint. I was doing the introduction here. So let me go back to that. And Bob started his career with Schlumberger and has spent over 30 years working in independent consulting with petrophysics, reservoir, and completion engineering disciplines. He's been an SP Distinguished Lecturer, and he's received awards from SPE. I think you'll enjoy all the various examples he has to share with you today. He is well published. He has over 40 technical papers in this discipline of petrophysics with completions, horizontal wells, and reservoir characterization. Bob teaches several courses for SCA. They're listed here: evaluating well performance for unconventional and conventional reservoirs, the practical interpretation of open hole logs, predicting organic shale well performance, and the course that relates most to the webinar topic today, refrac candidate selection, execution, and performance evaluation for conventional and unconventional reservoirs. This class is offered in a live online format, April 4th through 7th. So that's a half-day format offered virtually, so you can take it from anywhere in the world. And for this particular session, it's offered in the mornings in Central Time Zones. You can also contact us if you would like to offer this class in-house, or if you would like to attend some of Bob's other classes. We have a number of live online classes that are coming up soon. The class that Dr. Michael Perch teaches on Introduction to Subsurface Machine Learning is scheduled for May 2nd through 5th. We have Dr. John Lee speaking on the performance forecasting for low permeability reservoirs. That's also in live online format in the mornings, February 28th through 3rd. And then we have carbon capture utilization and storage with an engineering perspective. This is offered by Dr. Christine Konmitis and Dr. Demetrius Hazignatu. It's offered in the mornings, March 14th through 18th. So sign up for that. It's coming very soon. The next free webinar on the SCA schedule is Dr. Robello Samuel, who'll be speaking on what performance efficiency and design have to do with well design, engineering, and real-time operations. So choose SCA for all of your training needs. In addition, we offer consulting services, and we do direct hire staffing services for both full-time and consulting projects. And so I'm going to pass the presentation rights over to Bob and let you get started. Thanks, Bob.
All right. Thank you, Susan. You hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Get the full screen guy here going. All right. Look good? Good to go?
Yes. Yes.
Looks okay. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for your attention this afternoon. We got some pretty interesting results from this, looking at actual results from refracs. In the past, we've only used theoretical analysis, how much oil and gas is left, and made assumptions on how much you're going to get out. And we actually started looking at the results from refracs. We were pleasantly surprised it was as good or better than what we were expecting. So we'll share those details here today. We started with a list of all the refrac wells. I found 58 in the Eagle Ford that were single well leases, and which have individual production declines. With those, we looked at the refrac, the post-refrac performance, the decline curve. We used the actual refrac production until the extrapolation point, and then extrapolated it out to 30 years and ran economics on it. And the prior work, even up through this summer at the parent-child conference, we were presenting some refrac work where we assumed 100% recovery of stranded oil and gas. The Eagle Ford study we did before was showing about 110% rate of return. And we're seeing 85 here. So the numbers we were predicting earlier are actually not too far off. So anyway, so it's encouraging. Refracs may stop being the Rodney Dangerfield of the oil field at some point here. We keep hoping, because they're definitely competitive with new wells. Which you should, hopefully, if you walk away with one thing today is you've got a choice to make. That refracs do have attractive economics. They are better than new wells in some cases, and they should be a part of everybody's program, hopefully. But right now, it's kind of slow getting off the mark right now. A lot of people talking about it, but not a lot of follow through so far. Basically, the P50 rate of return was basically 85%. So that's pretty good. I used the 20% rate of return cutoff, and 54 of the 58 single well leases met that cutoff. So it basically we assumed basically 8 million for the 10,000 foot laterals on the economics for the new wells. And then the Haynesville was similar. We got a P50 rate of return for the Haynesville sample, 95%. Definitely competitive. And the thing is that your first refracs are probably going to be from your P10s, not your P50s, and the rates there are way off the charts. Good. The new wells, when you say compared to new wells, well, new wells are not a constant. You could have a 50 barrel a foot new well or a 60 barrel a foot new well. If you got a lot of 60 to 70, 80 barrel a foot new wells, yeah, you probably can't compete with refracs. But you look at this chart here in the Eagle Ford, say take an average GOR of 1054, your P50s at 85%. You got to have 55 barrel per foot wells, assuming 10,000 foot laterals, to make that work, to make that new well have a higher rate of return than the refrac. So it's definitely competitive. Some examples. This is one of the examples from the Eagle Ford. It was actually had two refracs. You had a diverter refrac in July of 2016, and then a liner refrac in 2017. Pretty good decline number, more than enough data to get a good decline on there. All these had more than enough history to get a reasonably good tie. We didn't have any with just a few months production. Most of these were pretty good. The original completion was 776 pounds per foot, 17 barrels a foot loading, 51 foot clusters. The diverter refrac actually had a positive rate of return, albeit 22%, but then basically a recovery factor of about 3.9%. The original recovery factor was 3.1%, and with the diverter refrac in 2016, it increased that to 3.9. It was actually economic. assuming a 1.5 million diversion refrac cost. The big money though is the liner refrac. In December 2017, they did a liner refrac, 17-foot clusters. Here's your loading on top there, and pretty much typical loading for recent wells. And look at the economics on that. 79% rate of return. That works all day long. And the key thing there is look at the recovery factor. I mean, theoretically, you've got a 15% maximum recovery factor for any of these, given the solution gas drive, assuming that the solution gas drive. This was getting close to 14%, and we'll show you in a little bit that that's actually higher than what we're seeing on new wells in the area, which was very interesting. We didn't expect to see that. Cluster spacing, it's all about cluster spacing. This model was for the Permian, but very similar perms here to the Eagle Ford and really organic shales in general, liquids rich. You had 50-foot cluster spacing on the original frac model, and basically 5.9% is predicted. The actual was 5.8. This was not the well we just showed, but another well we just looked at. And then the rate of return on the left side is, depending on, we had 20-foot cluster spacing, and we're seeing, a little bit better than that. But at any rate, actually 9.6 versus 11.4. So we think cluster spacing is the main driver here, albeit that, your proppant loading and fluid loading needs to be up there, but, it's the main reason that you're getting improved recoveries is you're getting more take points closer together. Here's a distribution of all 54 wells. You can see that you got some pretty good ones here in the 400% range with real high NPVs. Pretty good. You've got quite a few wells, again, majority are over 54, 58, so over 20% rate of return. Your assumptions for the costs on there. These are the actual wells by county with all the numbers. And then we'll have these slides available at the end for anybody that wants them. So anyway, we can provide that. You'll need to take notes on these things. Anybody wants a copy of it. This is where they're located. Quite a few down in Carnes and DeWitt, and then quite a few up there in the College Station, Eagle Vine area. But that's where they're located. One thing that was interesting in one of the areas was that the actual post-refrac recovery factors, which basically took the cumulative production prior to the refrac and then the extrapolated UR from the refrac forward, you're seeing an average of 72 barrels a foot on these recovery, where the new wells with pretty much identical completions, actually a little bit higher proppant loading for that matter, 46 barrels a foot. And you can see the distribution there. It's not just a random, picture. It's fairly consistent. And these are all pretty close to each other. Here's your numbers on there. Your average on the new wells offset was about 3,500 pounds per foot and 55 barrels a foot. We only had 2,100 on 2,200 on the refracs of 44. And yet the recovery factor averaged 13.5% for the total with the refracs, and you're only at 8.8% on the new wells. So, and this is where they're located. They're basically the orange ones are the refracs, the blues, the well control. We had really good well control there to get a good oil in place number. And the green offsets that had similar spacing. So we think it's evidence that your fractures are reorienting. You could be getting some from having a little bit more frac length, but that's unlikely because typically frac lengths, you don't see too much in the production history matching or interference tests more than 300-400 feet at the most. So longer lengths, I don't think are going to help you that much, but they may. But we think it's reorientation is what's going on. So that's interesting. Now, again, that's specific to the Eagle Ford. I'm not saying you're going to have this in the Haynesville because the Eagle Ford's got a relatively low stress anisotropy. So it's you only have to deplete the well about 1,000 pounds to overcome the maximum stress contrast that the original well had. So at most depth. So anyway, but Haynesville's next. We looked at that. We had 16 examples. Here's a good example from there. Definitely got a good uptick from the refrac. There's your post-frac analysis on that particular well. 81% rate of return over in Bienville Parish. I've used a $5 million AFV on the Haynesville and a 3.75 for the Eagle Ford, but pretty strong, and so basically I think all 16 were economic. There's your numbers there. Distribution. Again, your first ones are probably going to be in the P10, which is going to be around 200%, which is definitely competitive with new wells. I mean, the argument that refracs are not competitive with new wells is just not really supported by this data. It might have been in the past when they had diverter only jobs where you don't have the mechanical isolation, but with mechanical isolation, the risk is largely eliminated on the execution, and then they're getting that down pretty well. Here's your numbers there. Again, good numbers, 95% P50, P10, 180%. Definitely competitive. You know, it's definitely can work with the boys. Not so much ducks, perhaps, because ducks are already there, but with new wells, if you're starting a new well from scratch, you definitely have a competitive edge with the refracs. And here's where the locations are, pretty well spread throughout the, most of them in Louisiana. Again, that's where most of the activity is anyway. So it looks good in the Haynesville as well. The next big benefit in terms of rate of return being the first one is that, and it's really a larger return in some areas, is that you protect infill child wells from asymmetric fracs. And there's a lot of evidence showing that this is a problem. I mean, it's probably the 800-pound gorilla that most operators are not really dealing with, just based on the conversations we've had where they're using these quote unquote small volume preloads, which basically do nothing to protect the child. They do help the parent from, having to be cleaned out, but we'll show you some examples here where that was disastrous when they actually went with a larger volume preload, which is what you need to do if you don't refrac it. Here's a microseismic from the Bakken. And again, this is a rock properties deal. It's not a formation specific deal. Basically, the distal side of that frac was not stimulated at all. They all went to the H1 parent well, which was depleted. It's a big pressure sink. So they say Devon's numbers are around 40% reduction in EUR, and it's probably a case here for 50, as far as having about half the reservoir undrained. The other thing that came out was, the sealed wellbore pressure monitoring, seeing that, showing the same thing, that parent well depletion basically created an asymmetric frac where you don't have one complete side, the distal side of your frac is not going to be drained in the child well. So it's a huge problem. How much of a problem is it? And really we'll get to that next, but then you really the only options you have here are to recharge the parent as a full volume preload, which you got to elevate the reservoir pressure up pretty close to where it was originally, or you do a refrac. And the volumes required are pretty substantial for that. But compare it to the cost of actually doing that. If you've got a 500,000 barrel new well with a GOR of 1054, it basically your loss of your PV10 loss is over $4 million. So the loss of production from the child well not being protected by the parent well refrac can be almost as much as the rate of return on the entire refrac. So it's definitely a big number, but a lot of people are not really wanting to deal with this for some reason. We got the case study from the Delaware Basin. Again, it's not Eagle Ford or Haynesville, but I mean, this is again mechanical in nature. It's not necessarily something that's formation specific. They did a 225,000 barrel preload and 157,000 barrel preload on 2 wells. The initial EURs were 1.3, just about 1.3 million on both. Post preload, bad. One was down to 500, and one was down to 107. So basically, you could have paid, basically for 9 with these 2 wells, you could have paid for 9 refracs with what it cost you on just the parent well production loss, not so much the child well. They never did offset this. This was a well that came in. These were done right before a merger. So, but there's your numbers. I mean, you're chugging along there, pretty good, strong EUR, but putting all that water volume in there, you just couldn't get it back. So, refrac would have been far superior here than trying to do the full volume preload. So, which again is the only option. Small volumes don't really work. So, next reason, you got a huge volume of stranded reserves. Again, the cluster spacing is really what drives it. Refracs can have 3 to 4 times the original recovery factor. A lot of these older wells, 50, 60 foot cluster spacing, you're seeing 2%, 3% recovery factors. It's basically, cluster spacing is the main driver because we're actually putting less proppant and fluid in per cluster now with the newer fracs, just because you have more clusters. And I don't know any area in the world where you put larger fracs and get lower results. So we're actually putting smaller fracs on each cluster, but we're getting better results. So that points to cluster spacing is really what's driving this. And one study was done in Eagle Ford showed only 7.5 foot of lateral distance being drained by each cluster, which 50, 60 foot. The original Eagle Ford wells had over 100 foot cluster spacing. So there's a lot of undrained rock in there to get that. Here's that pilot well that was done by Conoco. And again, it was an eye opener because basically 15% of your 50 foot cluster spacing is being drained. So there's a lot of opportunities for increasing the take points in between here. And what we're seeing is that by and large, the cluster spacing assumption, there's a model that we had before is pretty spot on. We're seeing that pretty much as a maximum. If you've got 50 foot cluster spacing, and you use the plot that we had earlier, then you can predict what the recovery factor is going to be. How many wells have got large cluster spacing? Well, but 2015 was kind of when everybody started getting on board. Again, you had a few people experimenting with some of the, some of them here, but by and large, let me get my pointer here. I lost my laser. All right, yeah. Pre-2015 is probably the target-rich environment, although you've got some out in here that are. Because also keep in mind that a 40-foot cluster spacing with 60% cluster efficiency, which is what you typically get with diversion, is more like an 80 to 90-foot cluster spacing. So, your nominal spacing may not be your effective spacing on these. This graph is pretty good. This is the points here are from the actual Midland Basin study, but had a 4.6% was predicted, or close to predicted, right on trend with the 55-foot cluster spacing average, and the new wells are on the left here. So again, this should be a pretty good relationship. You can actually back out the OIP from this, or the minimum OIP that you have from this, if you just divide your cumulative production or your EUR, depending on what you want to use, by the recovery factor for this, and then do your 13-14% number. It's kind of a quick look, but not to be replaced by the oil in place and gas in place number, but it's a method to use. The geological risk is minimal. I mean, you've already got the logs most of the time. Here's an Eagle Ford log from, I think it's DeWitt County, but you can go in and basically know what your hydrocarbons are, know where your lateral is. I mean, there's no surprises. You're not having to, hope and pray that you got the right zone, you're in zone, you know where you are. So you got very little risk as far as what's going to go on there. One thing big in the Eagle Ford, you notice those little the red spotted wells on the map. A lot of those are gas condensate wells, and basically the condensate distribution varies quite a bit. We saw 18 to 148 variation within 2 miles down in LaSalle County, which is the example we had next. This particular example here. So I mean, if you've already got a condensate yield prior to the refrac, from the original production, your refrac ought to be fairly similar, and it reduces some of this uncertainty. I mean, you can see this, so you've got a pretty huge range here. So that's a help. Okay. One thing we do, we know that your recoveries are pretty much going to be consistent if you do a best practices refrac, fairly close cluster spacing, adequate proppant and fluid loading, slick wall, pretty much everybody's gone to that. 13.7 is what we're getting for a P50 on oil, 40% on your gas condensate, and 60 for dry gas. We don't have that many samples for dry gas, but it should be, that passes the smell test, because conventional is a little bit higher. To get the full 15% on oil and a full 70% or so in the gas, I mean, you think you'd have to have cluster spacing that's tighter than what people are using. Again, if you're draining 7.5 feet, and even with 15-foot clusters, you still have undrained rock there. But and that's what I think we're seeing with this reorientation. We think the reorientation is actually widening that window, and that's why the new wells underperform the refracs on that study we showed earlier. So the seventh thing, is you got less pressure supply chain. That's a big thing right now. I mean, you don't need new casing in the vertical section, tubing pumps, all that. Basically, you've got a lot of stuff out there already that you need that you don't have to go get. And with the supply chain issues now, that's not an insignificant factor. One thing one of the majors I talked to a few weeks ago was thinking about looking at really hard, or they're looking at it real hard, is if you get enough of these going and you consistently hit successful results, if you're economic in all your cases, you've got PUDs. And I've had 2 reservoir engineering groups bless this concept that basically you can book P1 reserves with refracs. Nobody's done this yet because very few people have this consistency. And back in the diverter days, you couldn't really guarantee that, and then your EURs weren't going to be that significant. But with the liner days, if you can get back to almost the original total recovery factor from a brand new well, you got some pretty good PUD values there. But that could be a significant addition to the asset base, but if it's done right. Carbon footprint's a buzzword now. I mean, I don't know how many ESG conferences I see going now, or ESG papers and conferences, but you basically don't have to drill a well, which is a huge carbon use. So I mean, just the drilling uses over 40,000 gallons of diesel, which is quite a bit of carbon. So this is good for trying to check that box, which is becoming more and more important. Again, no mob, no drilling. You know, there's a lot of moving parts are eliminated with the refrac. So it's and then last thing is really the most important thing, because it's really what points to being able to have successful refracs consistently without surprises, is mechanical isolation. You know, with using expandable liners or cemented casing, you know, the results on the reservoir are fairly similar. You know, you're a little more expensive to use the cemented, but nonetheless, you ought to be able to get the same results. And you ought to have a competitive rate of return new well drilling with that. Okay. These are the things that, you know, basically you don't have to worry about. You know, it's a lot of moving parts are removed. This is the PUD discussion we talked about earlier. And there's the reference there. I can get you that reference if you want. So again, you know, 5 to 6 times that's not cast in stone, but basically you have to show that you're not going to mess up. So you have to show that each refrac is going to be successful. And with the proper candidate selection, which, you know, is fairly straightforward, the proper execution and best practices, the risk of failure is pretty low. It's never zero, but it's pretty low right now. A lot lower than it was back in the diverter days. The carbon footprint, again, you know, it's, you know, a lot less moving parts, a lot fewer vehicles going out there. You know, the whole entire drilling process is gone. So, but the last part, the mechanical, it bears a little bit of investigation here. The looking at XLE is very important, extreme limited entry, because one thing about XLE is a lot of the studies that were done, in fact, almost all the studies that were done were on new wells, where the reservoir pressure is fairly homogeneous among the clusters. And refracs are not that case. You could have, you know, several thousand pounds of drawdown. The equation for the delta P required incorporates the delta P, the closure stress difference. You know, it's a near wellbore friction. You know, breakdown pressure goes into that. You know, basically any kind of tortuosity like near wellbore. You know, those are all factors in there you have to overcome. The original rules of thumb of 400 pounds back in the 80s we used, you know, was making several assumptions that you didn't have that much heterogeneity. But now we're seeing that in order to get good distribution to control fluid loss into the lower or the lower pressure, higher permeability, you know, clusters or natural fracture, you know, areas, you need about 3,000 psi, and that number could be larger for refracs theoretically. Again, because that's a new well. Those 2 papers there, the referenced, are all new wells. But you know, anyway, you don't want less than that. And what we're seeing on a lot of these studies is that operators are still not really buying into this. You know, typically the ones we have in the example that went over with the refrac reorientation were all around 500 psi delta P. So, you know, it's really not enough. So you're not going to get 100% cluster efficiency without going to 3,000 pounds. It's possible if you have severely depleted zones that you may not get there still. But you definitely don't want to go low on this number. This is a number that needs to be up there. And some operators are starting to back off when they tried this, because what we're seeing with these smaller perforations that, you know, they would, you know, going to multiple perforations requires smaller perforations. You're getting a lot of erosion on those, and they're dropping the pressure drops down to less than 2,000 pounds to try and get the 1,000 to 1,500 pound post erosion number. But you know, that may not be helpful, because the studies clearly show you need 25 to 3,000 pounds, not 2,100 to 3,000 pounds. There's one from Devon, really good paper on the volume to first response from this sealed wellbore pressure monitoring. You know, basically the idea is if you've got high delta P's and you limit your fluid loss into the runners, then you're going to see a very long delay or high volume pump before you see a hit on your offset well. And you're looking for pressure. You got a pressure monitor on the blue wells that shows at the surface when the pressure wave hit from the refrac. Less than 2,500 pounds, you're going to see, you know, uneven fluid. You're going to see fairly early hits. You know, there's been a lot of work on avoiding frac hits, but I think if we get everybody going to XLE and doing it right, I think those discussions are going to be reduced quite a bit. Here's another plot here, basically showing that, you know, the 500 to 600 pounds, where a lot of these are, you've got a really low delta P there. You're not getting the delay. You're getting some runaways. You're getting some very early hits there on those little blue ones up to the left here. So these are very early arrivals. You're not getting high cluster efficiency. Out here, you're getting very high cluster efficiency. And this has been backed up with fiber optics. There's a paper just presented a couple weeks ago at the conference, Refrac conference, showing much better uniformity with the higher delta Ps and the single hole at the top of the casing, which is what we're recommended. Talk about that coming up. But yeah, this is definitely proof that it works, but it also shows that if you got lower pressures that you can expect to have basically lower than you need to cluster efficiency. Another case here, a lot much more uniformity with the higher delta P. Less than 1,500 pounds, huge scatter. So I mean, it's definitely a number that you need to look at. And like I say, most operators I've looked at, most of the completions I've looked at are not doing this for some reason. The big thing is post erosion. Here's one where they had 5,000 pounds, pre-frac and pre-erosion, then down to about 400 or 500 pounds after it. So this is the big problem with the perforation erosion, is that you've got to try to have this effect minimized to get at least 1,000 pounds to 1,500 pounds post erosion. That's really the big number. The pre-erosion number is not as important as the post erosion number. But and what we're seeing is there's evidence that larger perforations can give you this. The single holes at the top, and we're recommending about 30-degree offset. You'll introduce a little more tortuosity than you would if you had it right at the very top. But I've heard of 2 operators that have had problems with excessive proppant flowback when they put the holes right at the very top, since the hole is lined up with fracture. You get the longitudinal fracture initiating at the top of the wellbore to start with, and then it flips to transverse. But if you've got that hole right there, I think you're going to get more proppant flow back. I don't know if anybody's tried that yet, but that seems to me to be a logical way to do it. Again, you want to try and limit the length of the longitudinal if you can. A single point is going to be better than a 2-foot span, which some people are still using. Larger perforations from that SP paper showing over smaller. And it was an interesting study that Repsol did in the Marcellus. There's a reference there that going from 0.42 to 0.46 had quite a remarkable effect. The erosion dropped down quite a bit. You had much more uniformity. Your tortuosity dropped down, and also your breakdown pressure went down. And tortuosity and breakdown pressure are both part of the XLE equation. You're going to have to, so you're basically giving it a much clearer path and putting a lot more energy into the frac when you do this. Are people doing this yet? Not yet, not wholesale, but there's several people who are, but the ones that are doing it seem to like it, the single shot at the top of the casing. Another little cartoon here on the longitudinal fracs. You spread this out over 2 feet. A lot of people with 6 shots per foot over 2-foot intervals, sometimes 1-foot interval. You've got a much longer area. Does this make a difference? It's something worth looking at. It's not going to hurt you. It's having a single point. Ideally the initial longitudinal frac is probably going to be less long, possibly. Again, this is something that can work. And the other thing that came out of the last conference in Scottsdale was some of the operators have noticed that acidizing doesn't help this. If you run a lot of acid ahead of time, you can actually get more communication between the stages. One of the problems is that you've got to use the 0.5, 0.5. When you look at the numbers for delta P at say 90 barrels a minute with 15 clusters, 6 barrels a minute per cluster or more. Typically people are going higher, 6 to 9. You see 9 is fairly good, 8 to 9. But you need a 0.5-inch hole, because if you go with smaller than that, you're going to have way too much friction. You're going to have like 6,000-7,000 pounds of friction if you go with a 0.4 hole. So on the refrac, that kind of limits your choices. You really need to have that ID to get the larger gun size in there, and this talks about that there. So it does kind of restrict your options as far as the how you complete it. It's because the cemented 4-inch, which is probably the most commonly used system right now, the biggest you can run is a 2 7/8 right now to get that, and that's going to give you a 0.4-inch hole, which you're going to need to have 2 0.4-inch holes, which you're going to erode faster. You're not going to have as good control, and a lot of the benefits of the single shot go away when you start doing that. Communication between stages is an issue. Again, this is about the initiation of the longitudinal fracture. One thing with refracs is that if we are getting reorientation, say in the Eagle Ford or Barnett, I'm not sure it happens in the other formations yet. We haven't documented that, but if you're getting, basically, if you're getting much wider SRV from the reorientation, you might be able to move your clusters farther apart. This is suggesting, this Conoco paper here is suggesting that your 15-foot cluster spacing, you're having quite a few leaks between stages, you can see communication. We're going out to larger spacings, help that. So the refracs may be more forgiving than new wells in this respect, in terms of giving you that. So Again, that's just speculation at this point, but something worth looking at. Okay, to summarize, expandables typically make more sense for larger holes. Again, full disclosure, I work with Inventure and they do expandables, so I apologize for the commercialism, but that's the fact that you really have to have the larger holes. You have to have the larger diameter to be able to do that. So, at any rate, again, 30 degrees off vertical is what I'm recommending. You go much farther than that, you're going to have increased tortuosity, and tortuosity goes into that delta P. And you really need to as much delta P as you can on these. And so if you can lower your breakdown pressure, you can increase your uniformity and you can lower your near wellbore tortuosity. That's all going to help add to that delta P to get the diversion going on. What Conoco's doing now a lot is post-frac step-down tests are pretty good. That paper referenced on the previous slide has got that. To see what's going on. We may have to spread these out a little more. I know from the reservoir perspective, going to 50 feet makes a lot more sense. We're seeing good results, but if your stages are talking to each other, that kind of limits that effectiveness there. And the sealed wellbore pressure monitoring is great. I mean, if you've got the opportunity to do that and offset wells nearby, that's a really neat little technique that can try to verify XLE success. If you think you're getting good diversion, but you're seeing real early hits, you're probably not getting good diversion. And it's possible you might need to make wider space. One of the frac consultants that's out there has started to recommend 30 to 35 feet in the Eagle Ford, and mainly because of the modeling in the frac model. But I talked to him last week about it. But basically, it's possible that with refracs and with reorientation, you can have a wider space and still get pretty good drainage of the SRV. So to summarize, the rates of return are highly competitive with new wells. Again, actual post refrac results confirm that. It's no longer just theoretical. You got the hard numbers now on a decent number of wells. Again, there's your numbers on that. Haynesville, same, really good competitive rates of return. The argument that refracs can't compete on a rate of return basis is just not supported by the data. Everybody's thinking of the old diverter refracs, I think. We always had a kind of a joke that the people that were out in the field during the diverter disasters are now in the C-suites, so that's why we're not seeing a lot of checks being written for these. But it's a whole new ball game now. I mean, since most operators since about 2018, early 2019 have all gone mechanical. The only place they're doing a lot of diverter right now is in the Barnett, but most areas are not doing diverter refracs that I'm aware of, at least not very many. Diverter only refracs. I mean, inter-stage is not the same. If you use actual diverter within the stage, that's different, because that is going on. That's not as good as XLE, but it's better than not doing any kind of diversion. The big thing, the infield shot wells, the 800-pound gorilla, you got to refrac these parent wells. I mean, and just put them in the zipper pattern. Just have a parent well ready to go, and just reline it and just put it in the normal pattern. It's not that big a deal. And in the small volume preloads, you're going to lose the reserves. Large volume preloads, you're going to kill the well. So I mean, you really don't have a lot of choices there. But unfortunately, very few operators are doing it. I take that back. A lot of the refracs that are done by several of the majors in the Eagle Ford are parent protection refracs. They also tend to make money too. So it's actually a positive rate of return versus you had a huge hit. Almost 1 million barrels was lost on that one well in West Texas by doing the full volume preload, which is all you can do if you don't do a refrac to protect the child. Again, a lot of people are doing small volumes. That's not a good idea. Again, but the refracs make a lot more sense there. Again, huge volumes of stranded reserves. Look at that cluster spacing versus a recovery factor plot. You can have up to 3 to 4 times the original recovery factors on these, particularly if you have poor cluster efficiency on the initial wells. I mean, the Schlumberger study showed that 2 out of 3 clusters are producing. The Liberty study showed a 59% average cluster efficiency without diversion, which basically means your 40-foot clusters are more like 60-foot clusters, and you can run the numbers on that. So there's a lot of oil and gas out there stranded. There's over 8,000 wells in the Eagle Ford that have large cluster spacing based on the completion times. Prior to 2015, it's like 8,500 or so. A lot of wells there. You got a pretty big inventory, and we did a preliminary economic analysis of those, and basically you were seeing about 70% of them look like they're going to be economic. So it's not 100%, because some of them were doggy locations initially drilled, but by and large, there's a lot of inventory out there for refracs. I didn't run the numbers on the Haynesville, but it's probably, fairly similar. There's a lot of activity up there back in 2010 before people really got into close cluster spacing. Where are we going here? Okay. The condensate yield, again, if that's an issue in the Eagle Ford, basically you got that nailed down going in. You know what it is. You don't have to guess. When the recovery factors are getting fairly consistent right now, we're seeing enough data to support this. So if you know what the current recovery factor is, if you got a 3.7% recovery factor right now, you basically got another 10% left. So whatever your OIP is times 10% is going to be your expected recoverable. And we're using that assumption, we're getting pretty close to the same rate of return as we are from the actual results. So that's nice. That's a good story that came together. Originally, people said, well, how do you know you're going to get all the oil out? Refrac, you're assuming that you're going to get all the stranded reserves out. He goes, well, you're right. We're getting actually more than we expected. So that was a pleasant surprise. I assumed it was going to be less going in, but I think with this possible reorientation, we're seeing higher than expected recovery factors with the refracs. Again, it's a lot fewer moving parts, which is a big issue right now. Just getting stuff out to location, getting people. It's all a hassle right now. It's not real smooth out there, and you're eliminating a lot of these loose ends by doing refracs. A lot of stuff's already done. And if ESG, compliance or sustainability is an issue, which a lot of the capital providers are starting to ask for that. Then that's you're checking that box pretty nicely and also making money. So, I mean, it's not just a symbolic gesture. It's really a tangible action that's taking positive steps to give you a better rate of return. Again, the booking is a biggie. Nobody's done this yet, to my knowledge, but the companies that have done a lot of these refracs are looking at it hard, because that could be a huge boon. If you've got refrac candidates behind pipe, you can document and show that you can do them successfully, consistently. Again, it's success. It's got to be consistently economically successful. That's the big thing. So if it's spotty results, then you got to start over again. But would it work? I haven't seen any reason that won't. Carbon footprint's lower, quite a bit lower to start with. Your well's already drilled. None of this stuff needs to be done. So it's a lot less traffic, a lot more. It's just overall a lot more sustainable process. I mean, it's got a lot fewer moving parts, and dollars to dollars, you're getting the same return as you would on a new well. Now, comparing it to a duct, not so much, but comparing to a well that you haven't drilled yet versus a refrac, your money is going to be just as well spent on refracs, which is something most operators don't believe right now. I mean, hopefully this type of information will start pushing the needle in the right direction on that. And again, the mechanical isolation has been the game changer. Most people are not aware. Even today, we're talking to people and says, well, we heard we had problems with it about 5-10 years ago. The technology has improved quite a bit with expandables, and people have gotten pretty good at putting the forward flush joint in and getting it cemented. So, I mean, the execution, as long as you get the wellbore cleaned out, which is really the big one, if you got proper clean out procedures in place, getting the liner down to bottom or getting the casing in there is not a huge issue. There aren't that many failed attempts that we've seen out there. So, but you got to do it right. I mean, you can't just go out there and wing it. But at any rate, the part is that's the big game changer right there, is mechanical isolation adoption, which has really, again, only been around for about the last 3 years or so. It's not something that's been around. 7-8 years ago, almost everybody was doing refracs with diverters over the entire interval. You have over 1,000 perforations sometimes as you're trying to divert. If you look at your barrels per minute per perf that you're trying to inject, it's pretty low. You're not going to get much done at 1/10 of a barrel a minute per perf, until you start diverting. But that's all I've got. I'd like to open up for questions, and hopefully we stimulated some thoughts here and some ideas.
Thanks, Bob. I'd like to remind the audience that you are muted, but you can ask questions using the Go to Webinar question feature.
Susan still with us?
I am. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Did I lose Susan?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, so we can ask questions using the Go to Webinar question feature. And please cover the questions that you have by inputting them in the GoToWebinar question feature. Later today, you'll receive a link to a recording of today's webinar, an evaluation form, and a link to register for Refrac candidate
Not hearing
selection,
you for some reason.
execution, and performance evaluation for conventional
Speaker
and
turned off.
unconventional reservoirs scheduled first April 4th through 7th in live online format. That's in the mornings. And then later this year, it's scheduled in person in SCA's Houston Training Center, July 25th through 27th, and in Midland, November 7th through 8th. So Bob, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I didn't. My speaker turned off for some reason.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
great. So
The talk
tell
was okay,
us,
didn't it?
thanks for your presentation today. Why haven't refracs played a role in operators' capital deployment plans? As we're seeing increase in prices, why aren't you seeing more increased refrac announcements?
It's been a real head scratcher, as you can tell, because I've lost a lot of hair over this. But I think the reason is what we touched on at the end there is that refracs are not all the same. Yet a lot of people kind of put them all in one box. I mean, there's the initial diverter fracs, which were hit or miss, and really pump and pray is what it amounted to. They were successful in some cases, but not that consistent. And you had a huge mechanical task because you'd have 1,000 to 1,200 perforations open. And you're pumping, you can only pump so much. You can't pump at 1,000 barrels a minute to even get 1 barrel a minute per perf. I mean, you're not going to get, you're going to have to divert, and and that gets messy, and it's just not a real straightforward deal. But now with the mechanical isolation, though, the variability in results is much better, much lower. I mean, you've got a lot more consistent results, and basically a refrac's no different from well once you get the liner in the hole. Is not, you basically pump the same job you would on a new well. So I think it's education. I think it's awareness. Again, I'd say we're still hearing questions from operators that say, well, I didn't realize you could get reliable results with the expandables or with the cementids, or, we can get consistent results. And that's the data said, yeah, we can now. We've got a lot of those boxes checked.
So prices matter. How sensitive are the results to the volatile NYMEX price strip?
Yeah, it's interesting because we were running economics back and forth for the last several months, and it's been up and down. But by and large, these were flying at the lower prices. And $30, $40 oil, we still had a pretty high percentage of wells that were showing economic results. It wasn't it wasn't as high as what we're looking at here, but pretty close though. It's still, even at lower prices, they tended to make sense. I mean, you got a lot of room to work with. I mean, your P50 is around 100%. I mean, even at lower prices, that might go down to 60%, 70%. And also in the NYMEX, the big variability has been in the near years, not the far years. Pretty much you're running these out to 30 years. And granted, time value money figures in there at some point, but by and large, the prices have been fairly stable in the long term on the NYMEX for quite some time now. It doesn't vary as much as you think it would be. So it really doesn't make that much effect, but they definitely work at lower prices. So it's at these prices, for sure, but at lower prices, they were working as well.
Great. And I'll remind our audience again, you can't raise your hand because you're muted. So you need to type your questions in the chat, in the question feature in GoToWebinar. So Bob, you mentioned that compared to ducks, it's intuitively obvious that it's more economic to do refracs compared to drilling a new well. But how does it compare to ducks?
Right, that's a good question. It's tough to compete with ducks. I mean, if you can get new well results and you've already got the well drilled, a lot of the advantages of the refrac go away. I mean, because it's already a sunk cost, so it's probably better to if you have ducks in the inventory to do it. But there's over 130 hours in the Eagle Ford right now, and and there's only doing refracs. I mean, there's like 3 companies that have done more than 3 or 4. And a lot of companies have done, I think there's maybe a dozen companies that have done refracs out of that 130 wells. So a lot of these smaller operators, like we had one operator we talked to not too long ago that all their wells were prior to 2015. So their entire field was a refrac candidate. I mean, and they had over 100 wells. So I mean, there's a huge inventory out there of refract wells to work with. But if you've got a duct already, and if you're a major company that has, several ducts lined up, you're clearly better off spending your money on those than you are on a refract. But as far as starting a well from scratch, by and large, the refract is going to give you as good or better results.
So Bob, you also mentioned the orientation impacts the recovery. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, well, we think we're seeing the papers we've seen in Eagle Ford on stress anisotropy, your maximum minimum stress direction and attitude suggests that you've got less than 500 psi of anisotropy there. If you lower an Eagle Ford well by 1,000 pounds of reservoir pressure, that's 667 psi at a 20.25 poissons. So just 1,000-pound depletion will get that to flip. Your maximum stress direction is no longer your maximum stress direction. Assuming the drainage in the initial frac took place along the maximum stress direction, parallel to the faults, it could be length as well. We know clearly we're getting better production on an EUR per foot out of a refrac than you are on new wells. In that case we looked at, but and the only two reasons we can hypothesize is the reorientation or possibly increased frac length, but I don't see the increased frac length as moving the bar that just intuitively from what I've seen. Typically you see 500, 600, 700 feet created lengths on these wells, but then the producing lengths from, once they get online with the offset monitoring, everything, your 300 foot is probably what most places are looking at. So, it's hard to get a very long fracture to produce out here in these shales. The large percentage of the volume that's flowing is unpropped. So it's hard to keep that open.
So you mentioned the importance of cluster spacing. Would you say that's the most impactful factor for improved recovery, or are there others that could be equally significant?
I think that's the 800-pound gorilla. I think the cluster spacing is really it, because really, like I mentioned earlier, you've got less volume per fracture than you did on some of the 2010 and 11 fracks. I mean, because you were pumping smaller volumes overall. I mean, you might be pumping 1,000 pounds a foot, but in 300,000 pounds and 3 clusters, you got 100,000 pounds per cluster. Now you're pumping 400 to 500,000 pounds in 10 clusters. So in some cases, you've cut the proppant volume per cluster back by almost 50%. And smaller jobs never result in lower production or higher production. You got it typically more is more in that respect. So it's, people say, well, I've got my proppant loading up. That's making better wells. No, you actually need to do that to feed the fracs with, less proppant than you were feeding them with. So it's the cluster spacing versus recovery factors. Whenever we plotted it up, in fact, the ERTEC paper last year had an actual recovery factor versus the theoretical from that cluster spacing, and by and large, we saw an agreement there. It was pretty much a maximum, because if you got lower cluster efficiency, it's going to drop that number down. If you got 50-foot cluster spacing, you may actually be effectively at 70, and so you're at 50 foot, you're seeing less than what you should at the in that recovery factor on the graph we had.
So Bob, you emphasized the importance of protecting the infill child wells from asymmetrical fracs. Could you talk more about the economic ramifications of that?
Sure. Again, this is probably the place that people are leaving the most money on the table. Even if you can get a zero rate of return on your refrac, you're still going to be $3 to $4 million ahead on that, and it's something that people just don't want to deal with for some reason. But it's by and large, the majority of operators that have in situations like that are happy with the preloads, 10, 20,000 barrel preload, which have virtually no effect on the child well asymmetry. You're going to get the same asymmetric frac unless you replace the original volume with a full volume, or unless you refrac it. So really the options are limited, and most people are going with the option to not clean out the parent well. I mean, cleaning out a parent well with coil tubing and all that once it's on production is a real pain, and it's expensive. So yeah, it's not without benefit to go into the small volume preload, because a small volume preload can, especially if you keep pressure on it during the frac, the offset frac, you can keep that well bore clean without having having a lot of proppant blow into it. You can protect the near well bore and keep the parent online, but it doesn't do anything for the child. The child is going to be basically, all your stimulated area is going to be between the parent well and the child, and the distal side of the child well is going to be, pretty much untouched. So that's where you lose most of your production.
And by what factor on that loss? What How significant is this to the
Devin,
economics?
we've tried to come up with those numbers, and the last paper we put together, we tried to come up with those numbers, but Devin did a pretty good analysis of their stuff, and their numbers that Brendan had in his paper back in 19 was around 40% reduction in the EUR in the child well, which makes sense. When you look at our seismic, the distal side is not being stimulated, so it's it makes sense that you're getting a substantial chunk of that not being recovered. It's all for rock mechanics. I mean, you're going from high stress to low stress. As soon as the frac sees that low stress, pocket around the parent well, it's going to go in that direction. It's going to follow the path of resistance, just like anything else in physics. So.
You mentioned that there could be a carbon footprint reduction. How would you suggest companies incorporate this into their ESG reporting?
Good question. I mean, that's something I defer to some of the ESG experts on that, and then, knock on wood, we don't want a carbon tax, but at some point it's probably going to be here. The rest of the world has been doing it, as much as it's, not on the top of everybody's list, but, if something like that comes through, then this is clearly something you can probably use because it is an offset. People are doing all kinds of stuff to get offsets now. So it's definitely, you convert your vehicles to natural gas, convert your frac pumps to natural gas, and not doing a new well. It should get some credit. I'm not, again, I have to defer to the guys in that line of work that can tell how to incorporate that. Right now I don't give us any way to have a direct financial benefit unless the carbon tax comes out. But at any rate, it's more sustainable. It's less moving parts. It's a lot easier to do actually. So, for nothing else, it's just fewer problems to deal with.
Simple is good sometimes.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Later today, you'll receive a link to the recording of today's webinar, an evaluation form, and a link to register for Refrac candidate selection, execution, and performance evaluation for conventional and unconventional reservoirs. That's scheduled April 4th through 7th in live online format. That's in morning in the Central Time Zone. It's scheduled in person in July 25th through 27th in Houston in SCA's training center, and in November 7th through 8th in Midland, Texas, also in person. So thanks for joining today's webinar. Goodbye.